The wind speaks a different language in the high country, a sharp, lonely tongue that scours the granite and whispers through the sparse pines. Silas knows this language. It's the only one he's had for company these past few years. He rides the fence-line, his horse, Boulder, moving with a steady, ground-eating gait. The air is cold, carrying the first real bite of autumn. Below, the valley floor is a tapestry of gold and rust, but up here, the world is gray rock and evergreen. That's when he hears it. Not the wind. Something else. A sound that slices right through the cold air, the high, frantic yelp of a dog, followed by a deeper, guttural snarl. Wolves. Then another sound, thin and sharp as a needle. A child's scream. Danger's close, and a rescue might be at hand. Before we see if justice or peril finds them, share in the comments. What's your favorite story about someone being saved against the odds? And if you're rooting for them, hit like and subscribe. Every muscle in Silas's body goes taut. He reins Boulder in, his head cocked, listening. The sounds come from a rocky draw just off his property line, a tangle of chokecherry and fallen logs. It's land that belongs to no one and everyone. A gray area bordering the reservation lands miles to the east. Another scream, choked off. He doesn't think. He spurs Boulder forward, pulling the Winchester from its scabbard. The horse crashes through the undergrowth, and the scene explodes into view. A pack of gray wolves, lean and hungry, circling two small figures. Two little girls. The older one stands over the smaller, a broken branch held like a spear, her face a mask of terror. The smaller child is on the ground, crying. A rangy cur, bleeding from its neck, makes a final, desperate lunge at the lead wolf before being thrown aside. Silas raises the rifle, the world narrowing to the space between the front sight and the wolf's shoulder. The shot cracks open the silence, and the lead wolf collapses in a heap. The rest of the pack, startled and confused, hesitates. That's all the opening he needed. With a roar that came from someplace deep and primal, he charged Boulder into their midst, firing again, not to hit, but to scatter. The pack broke, melting back into the shadows of the rocks and pines. Silence descended, heavy and ringing. The only sounds were the ragged, desperate sobs of the little girl on the ground and the heaving breaths of his horse. Silas dismounted, his rifle still held at the ready. The two girls were Apache, he saw that now. Their dark hair was unbound, their calico dresses torn and dusty. The older girl, maybe 8 or 9, still hadn't lowered her branch. Her dark eyes were fixed on him, filled with a fear that was now mixed with defiance. Her leg was bleeding, a dark stain spreading on the rough fabric of her dress from a bite. "It's all right," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "They're gone." The girl said nothing. She just watched him, every line of her small body radiating mistrust. He took a slow step forward, and from behind a massive boulder, a woman emerged. She moved with a liquid grace that was unnerving, a long knife held low in her hand. Her face was stark, her cheekbones high and sharp, her eyes holding the same fierce, untamed fire as the girl's, but magnified by a lifetime of hardship he could only guess at. She placed herself between him and the children without a word, a silent, deadly protector. He saw it all in that one moment. This wasn't just a woman. It was a she-bear defending her cubs, ready to fight a mountain if she had to. He stopped, raising his free hand slowly, palm open. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said, the words feeling clumsy and loud in the charged air. "Your girl is hurt. Let me help." Her eyes flickered to her daughter's bleeding leg, then back to him. The internal war was plain on her face, the primal need to protect her child versus the deep, ingrained distrust of a white man with a rifle. For a long, stretched moment, nobody moved. The wind sighed through the pines, carrying the metallic scent of blood. The world held its breath, waiting for her decision. Finally, with a barely perceptible nod, she lowered the knife an inch. It was the only permission he was going to get. Silas had bought his land 5 years ago, a piece of hardscrabble territory that no one else wanted. It was all he could afford after his wife, Martha, was taken by the fever. The small cabin they'd planned to build together, he built alone. The life they'd dreamed of, he buried with her. Now, his days were marked by the sun and the seasons, a cycle of mending fences, tending his small herd of cattle, and battling a loneliness so profound it felt like a physical weight. The nearest town, Redemption, was a full day's ride, and he rarely went. The town had a way of looking at a man like him, a man who kept to himself, whose grief was a cloak he never took off, with suspicion. They whispered about him, the quiet man on the mountain. He didn't care. The silence of the high country was better than the empty chatter of men who measured a man's worth by the size of his herd or the piety of his Sunday suit. He knew of the Apache who lived on the fringes. The government had pushed the Chiricahua onto a reservation miles away, but some families refused, choosing a life of bare-knuckled survival in the old lands, ghosts in a world that no longer wanted them. The people in Redemption spoke of them with a mixture of fear and contempt, calling them renegades, thieves. Silas had never seen them as anything more than shadows at the edge of his vision. Until now. Now, they had names and faces and bleeding wounds. The woman's name was Nalin. He wouldn't learn that for weeks. The girls were Chayton, the fierce older one, and Tala, the little one who now clung to her mother's leg. He knelt, pulling a clean rag and a small flask of carbolic acid from his saddlebags. He worked quietly, his movements slow and deliberate. He cleaned the wound on Chayton's leg, his touch surprisingly gentle. The girl flinched but didn't cry out, her eyes squeezed shut, her jaw tight. Nalin watched his every move, her hand never straying far from the knife at her waist. He wrapped the wound with the rag, tying it off securely. "It needs to be kept clean," he said, looking at Nalin. "Boil water. Wash it every day." She gave another terse nod. He stood up, backing away slowly, giving them space. He looked at the dead wolf, its gray fur already looking dull. He ought to take the pelt, but the thought of skinning it in front of them felt wrong, like a violation. He looked at their makeshift camp tucked behind the rocks, a simple wickiup of branches and hide, a fire pit cold and black. It was a shelter against the wind, but it wouldn't stand up to the snows that were coming. He mounted Boulder without another word and rode away, the image of the woman's proud, wary face burned into his mind. He hadn't gone more than 100 yards before he stopped. He couldn't just leave them. That night, the wind howled around his cabin, a mournful sound that echoed the emptiness inside him. He thought of Martha, of how fiercely she would have protected a child. He thought of the two little girls and their mother, alone in the dark with the wolves still out there. The next day, he rode back. He didn't go all the way to their camp. He left a sack on a flat rock within sight of the draw, a slab of bacon, a bag of flour, and a small pouch of salt. He turned and left without looking back. He did the same 2 days later, this time leaving a haunch of venison he'd shot. He never saw them, but when he returned the next time, the offerings were gone. It became a silent ritual. He was their provider, a ghost in their lives just as they had been in his. He'd sometimes catch a flicker of movement from the rocks as he rode away, a glimpse of a calico dress or a fall of black hair. He knew they were watching. One afternoon, a cold rain began to fall, the kind that soaked a man to the bone and promised snow on its heels. He found himself riding toward the draw, a heavy oilskin tarp tied behind his saddle. He found their camp deserted. The fire pit was a muddy pool, the wickiup sagging and dripping. Panic, cold and sharp, seized him. Had they left? Or had something worse happened? He followed a faint trail leading higher into the rocks, finding them huddled under a shallow overhang, shivering and miserable. Tala had a racking cough. This time, he didn't hesitate. He dismounted and walked right up to them. Nalin got to her feet, the knife in her hand, but there was less fire in her eyes now, replaced by a weary desperation. "This is no place for them," he said, his voice firm, gesturing at the girls. "The snow will be here by morning. You'll all freeze. Come with me." She stared at him, her pride warring with her fear for her children. He saw the tremble in Chayton's lip, heard the wet rattle in Tala's chest. "My cabin is warm. It's dry," he said, his voice softening. "There's food. Just until the storm passes." He waited, letting the offer settle in the cold, damp air. He wasn't asking, not really. He was telling her what had to happen. He was a man who understood necessity. He could see that she was, too. After a long moment, she slowly sheathed her knife. It was the most profound surrender he had ever witnessed. He helped them onto his horse, placing the girls in the saddle in front of him, wrapped in the oilskin. Nalin walked behind, her hand on Boulder's flank, as if to reassure herself they were not being taken, but led. The cabin was small, Just one room with a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table, and a built-in bunk. It was sparse, but it was clean, and, most importantly, it was warm. He settled the girls near the fire, wrapping them in thick wool blankets. Tala had fallen into a feverish sleep. Nalin stood by the door, a statue of unease, watching him as he moved about the small space, stirring the embers in the fireplace, putting a pot of water on to boil. "She needs willow bark tea," she said, her first full sentence to him. Her voice was low and melodic, at odds with her harsh exterior. "I have some," he replied, pulling a small cloth bag from a shelf. Martha had taught him about herbs and remedies. He prepared the tea, his hands moving with a familiar competence. He brought a cup to Nalin, and she took it, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting second. The touch was like a spark in the cold room. She administered the tea to Tala, coaxing the drowsy child to drink. For 3 days, the snow fell, blanketing the world in a thick layer of white and sealing them inside the cabin. The awkwardness of their forced proximity slowly began to thaw. The silence was no longer heavy with suspicion, but companionable. He learned things about them without words. He saw the way Nalin's hands were never idle. She found a tear in one of his shirts and mended it with thread unraveled from her own hem, her stitches small and perfect. He saw Chaitin's sharp intelligence in the way she watched him, how she quickly learned the routine of the cabin, fetching wood from the pile by the door, helping her mother without being asked. And he saw Tala's playful spirit return as the fever broke. She would watch him with wide, curious eyes, a small smile playing on her lips. He spoke little, but he acted. He made sure they were fed, that the fire never went out. He whittled a small, crude horse for Tala, who accepted it with a gasp of delight. He showed Chaitin how to check the dressing on her own leg, explaining how to tell if the healing was clean. He treated them not as burdens or curiosities, but as people. And Nalin watched it all. She saw the gentleness in this big, quiet man, the sadness in his eyes when he thought no one was looking. She saw the worn picture of a smiling woman on the mantelpiece and understood the shape of the hole in his life. One evening, as the storm finally abated, she spoke. "Your woman?" she asked, nodding toward the photograph. "My wife, Martha," he said. "Fever. For years ago." "You are alone," she stated, not a question but an observation. "Yes," he said. "We are alone, too," she said. And in that simple exchange, a bridge was built across the chasm of their 2 different worlds. She told him her husband, a great hunter named Kale, had been killed 2 winters past by white men who claimed he was poaching, though they were on their own ancestral lands. She and the girls had been on the run ever since, moving from place to place, belonging nowhere. When the snow melted enough for travel, he didn't tell them to leave. And they didn't go. Nalin and the girls moved into his small and used barn. It wasn't a perfect arrangement, but it offered shelter and a degree of separation that respected her pride. She refused to take charity. She began to contribute, using her knowledge of the land to find edible roots and herbs he didn't know existed. She tanned the hides of animals he hunted with a skill that astonished him, her work supple and strong. Chaitin, her leg now fully healed, helped him with small chores, her initial suspicion slowly morphing into a grudging respect. Tala followed him everywhere like a shadow, her quiet presence a comfort he hadn't realized he was missing. His solitary life was suddenly full. The silence of the cabin was now broken by the murmur of conversation from the barn, the occasional sound of Tala's laughter. The weight of his loneliness began to lift, so gradually he barely noticed it until he found himself smiling one afternoon, watching Nalin teach her daughters a string game under the shade of a cottonwood. But their fragile peace was not destined to last. The world beyond their mountain sanctuary was closing in. Jedediah Thorne, a rancher whose land bordered Silas's on the other side, was a man whose greed was as vast as the plains. He had long coveted Silas's spring-fed pastures and despised him for his refusal to sell. Thorne rode by one morning, his eyes cold and assessing as he took in the sight of the Apache girls playing near the barn. "Getting crowded up here, Silas," Thorne said, his voice dripping with false congeniality. "Heard you were running a charity for strays." "They're under my protection, Jedediah," Silas said, his voice low and hard. He stood between Thorne and the barn, a clear, unspoken warning. Thorne's lip curled into a sneer. You know the sentiment in town. Folks don't take kindly to harboring renegades. Causes trouble. A man could find himself on the wrong side of the law, or worse, he spurred his horse, calling over his shoulder. You'd be smart to get rid of them before they bring it down on you. The threat hung in the air long after Thorne was gone. Nalin had heard it all. That night, she packed their few belongings. We will leave in the morning, she said, her face set like stone. We will not bring this trouble to you. No, Silas said, standing in the doorway of the barn, blocking her path. This is your home now. This is not our home. We do not have 1 inch. Then we'll make it one, he said, the words surprising even himself. I'm not letting that man run you off. I'm not letting anyone run you off. You stay. He saw the conflict in her eyes, the hope warring with a lifetime of fear and betrayal. Why? She whispered. Why do you do this? Because it's right, he said simply. And because when I see you with them, I remember what a home is supposed to feel like. The admission was raw, vulnerable. It was more than he had said to anyone in years. She didn't look away. In her dark eyes, he saw an echo of his own loneliness, his own quiet strength. She didn't agree to stay, but she didn't leave. Thorne was true to his word. A week later, he rode up again, this time with the town sheriff, a portly, indecisive man named Calloway. Silas, Calloway said, avoiding his eyes. Jedediah here has filed a complaint. Says you're harboring vagrants. Trespassers. This is my land, Sheriff, Silas said calmly, stepping onto the porch. Nalin and the girls were inside the cabin behind him, watching through the window. They're my guests. Not according to Thorne. Calloway huffed, sweating under the midday sun. He says they're a danger to the community. He wants them removed. Sent back to the reservation. The words were a death sentence. Nalin had told him about the reservation, the sickness, the starvation, the despair. Sending them, there was no different from sending them to a grave. They're not vagrants, Silas said, his voice like iron. This woman works for me. She and her children live here, under my roof, under my protection. Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. Works for you? Doing what? Don't try and fool us, Silas. You're just another man with a taste for savage women. The town won't stand for it. These children need to be in a proper school, taught to be civilized. The threat was clear. The government-run Indian schools were notorious for stripping children of their culture, their language, their families. It was a threat aimed directly at Nalin's heart. Silas felt a rage build inside him, cold and pure. He was about to tell Thorne exactly where he could go when the cabin door opened. Nalin stepped out onto the porch. She was not dressed in her worn calico, but in a doeskin dress she must have kept carefully packed away. It was simple, adorned with delicate quill work, and it gave her an air of regal dignity. Chayton and Tala stood just behind her, holding her hands. She looked not at Silas, but directly at the sheriff. I am Nalin of the Chiricahua, she said. Her English was flawless, clear and without accent, a stark contrast to the few halting words she had used with him. It was a weapon she had kept hidden, and she wielded it now with devastating precision. My children are not vagrants. They are the daughters of Kale, a leader among our people. We are not a danger. The only danger here is the greed of this man, she said, her gaze shifting to Thorne, her eyes burning with contempt. Who wants this land and will use my children as an excuse to harm a good man who has shown us kindness? Sheriff Calloway blinked, taken aback by her eloquence and her sheer force of will. Thorne's face purpled with fury. Listen to her, spouting lies, he started, but Silas cut him off. She speaks the truth, Sheriff. And there's more. She's not just my worker. He took a breath, the next words changing everything. He hadn't planned them, but they came to him, solid and true. He turned and looked at Nalin, a question and a promise in his eyes. She met his gaze and gave the slightest, almost imperceptible nod. He turned back to the sheriff. She's my intended wife. This is her home. These are her children. And soon, they will be mine, too. Now, unless you have a warrant to remove a man's family from his own property, I suggest you and Mr. Thorne be on your way. The silence that followed was absolute. Calloway's jaw worked, but no sound came out. He looked from Silas's resolute face to Nalin's unyielding dignity, to the two small girls standing protectively by her side. He saw a family, a stubborn, unconventional, but undeniable family. He was a weak man, but not an entirely unjust one. He finally turned his tired eyes on Thorn. "He's right, Jedediah," Calloway said wearily. "There's nothing I can do. This is his property. They're his family. It's not against the law. This is an outrage." Thorn sputtered, but his threats were empty now. He had been outmaneuvered, his hypocrisy laid bare. With a final, venomous glare, he wrenched his horse around and galloped away, the sheriff following at a much slower, more thoughtful pace. They stood on the porch, the three of them, watching until the riders were just specks of dust on the horizon. The vast quiet of the mountain rushed back in to fill the space they had left. The threat was gone, at least for now. Silas turned to Nalin. The air between them was thick with all the things they had never said. "My intended wife?" she asked softly, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "Seemed like the quickest way to make a point," he said, his voice a low rumble. He felt a flush creep up his neck. "Unless you object." She looked at him, her gaze searching his. She saw no pity there, no sense of obligation. She saw respect. She saw a deep and abiding affection. She saw a man who had not tried to conquer her spirit, but had built a fortress to protect it. "And if I do not object?" she asked. He took a step closer, his heart hammering against his ribs. He reached out and gently took her hand. Her fingers were strong and capable, and they curled around his without hesitation. "Then I reckon I'm the luckiest man in this whole territory." Tala, sensing the shift, let go of her mother's hand and ran to him, wrapping her small arms around his leg and looking up at him with a trusting smile. Chayton watched them both, and for the first time, the fierce guard in her eyes softened into something like peace. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in hues of orange and rose. The wind whispered through the pines, but it no longer sounded lonely. It sounded like a promise. He looked at Nalin, at the strong, beautiful woman who had fought for her children with the ferocity of a wolf, and he knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his soul, that in rescuing her daughters, he had inadvertently saved himself. The prize he had earned wasn't a heart to be won, but a life to be shared, a home to be built, right here on the edge of the world, together. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion, overcoming prejudice, and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.